Story 1. The Midnight Caller of Elmwood Lane. It was a quiet Tuesday night, the kind where the silence of the suburban street was almost deafening. Sarah, a freelance graphic designer, was working late, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the glow of her monitor. Her husband, Mark, was away on a business trip, leaving her alone in their newly purchased, charmingly old house on Elmwood Lane. The house had a history. Of course, every old house does, but nothing sinister, just generations of happy families and quiet lives. Or so she thought. Around 2 a.m., the phone rang. Sarah jumped, startled. Who would be calling at this hour? She glanced at the caller ID, unknown number. A shiver ran down her spine. She hesitated. Then, curiosity, overriding caution, she answered. A low, guttural voice, barely a whisper, filled her ear. It was distorted, almost inhuman, like gravel being dragged across concrete. "I see you," it rasped. Sarah's blood ran cold. She slammed the phone down, her heart hammering against her ribs. She tried to rationalize it. A prank call, a wrong number, a drunk dialing. But the voice, the sheer malevolence in it, lingered. She spent the next hour pacing, checking locks, peering through curtains. The silence of the house, once comforting, now felt oppressive, heavy, with an unseen presence. She finally crawled back into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. Then, the phone rang again. Sarah gasped, her eyes darting to the clock. 3 a.m., the same unknown number. This time, she didn't answer. She just stared at the glowing screen, her breath caught in her throat. The phone rang and rang, a relentless, insistent summons that seemed to echo in the silent house. She could almost feel the caller's eyes on her, a cold, predatory gaze piercing through the walls. Finally, it stopped. Sarah let out a shaky breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She lay there, listening to the silence, her nerves frayed. Just as she was about to drift off, a new sound emerged. A faint scratching, coming from outside her bedroom window. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like fingernails dragging across the glass. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing it to stop, willing herself to disappear. But it didn't. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the house. Sarah slowly opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the window. The curtains were drawn, but she could see a faint shadow, a distorted silhouette pressed against the glass. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its head seemed to be tilted, as if listening. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped. Her body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The scratching intensified, and then, a faint, almost imperceptible crack appeared in the glass, radiating outwards like a spiderweb. The shadow seemed to press harder, its form becoming clearer, more defined. She could almost make out the outline of a hand, long and skeletal, its fingers tipped with sharp, black claws. Then, the phone rang again. Sarah jumped, her eyes darting to the nightstand. 4 a.m., the unknown number. This time, the scratching stopped. The shadow at the window seemed to recoil, its form dissolving back into the darkness. Sarah, trembling, slowly reached for the phone. She answered, her voice a barely audible whisper. "Hello." The same guttural voice, now closer, clearer, filled her ear. "You shouldn't have answered." And then, a click. The line went dead. Sarah dropped the phone, her hand shaking uncontrollably. She spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner of her bedroom, the lights on, a blanket wrapped tightly around her, listening to the silence, convinced that whatever had been outside was now inside, waiting. She never saw the shadow again, but the memory of that voice, that relentless scratching, and the chilling words still haunts her. She sold the house a month later, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, forever, listening for the midnight caller of Elmwood Lane. The terror of that night The chilling voice on the phone, and the skeletal shadow at her window, left an indelible mark on Sarah. She tried to dismiss it as a vivid nightmare, a product of stress and an overactive imagination, but the memory was too sharp, too real. The faint crack in her bedroom window, a jagged line against the glass, was a constant, tangible reminder that it had not been a dream. She spent the next few days in a state of heightened anxiety, jumping at every shadow, every unexpected sound. The once comforting silence of her home now felt heavy, pregnant with an unseen presence. She started to research Elmwood Lane, digging into its history, looking for any past incidents, any unsolved mysteries that might shed light on her terrifying encounter. The local library, dusty and quiet, became her sanctuary. She pored over old newspapers, microfiches, and town records. She found nothing overtly supernatural, no tales of hauntings or demonic entities. But she did find a series of articles from the early 1900s about a string of unsolved disappearances in the area. Young women, always alone, always at night, vanishing without a trace. The police had no leads, and the cases eventually went cold. The articles spoke of a pervasive fear that gripped the community, a sense of an unseen predator lurking in the shadows. A cold dread settled over Sarah. The midnight caller, the skeletal shadow, the chilling words, "I see you, you shouldn't have answered." It all began to coalesce into a horrifying narrative. Was the voice on the phone a modern manifestation of that ancient predator? Was the shadow at her window one of its victims, forever bound to the place where they had vanished? The thought was both terrifying and strangely compelling. She felt a morbid curiosity, a desperate need to understand, to unravel the mystery that had invaded her life. She started leaving her bedroom light on at night, a small, futile attempt to ward off the darkness. But the phone would still ring, always at 3 a.m., always the unknown number. She would stare at it, her heart pounding, willing it to stop, but it would ring and ring, a relentless, insistent summons. Sometimes, she would hear the faint scratching at her window, a chilling reminder that it was still out there, still watching, still waiting. She felt like a mouse in a trap, constantly aware of the predator lurking just beyond her sight. One night, unable to bear the suspense, she answered the phone. The same guttural voice, now clearer, more distinct, filled her ear. "You're still here," it rasped, a hint of amusement in its tone. "I like that." Sarah's breath hitched. She tried to speak, to demand answers, but her voice was a strangled gasp. The voice continued, a low, chilling monologue about patience, about waiting, about the sweet taste of fear. It spoke of shadows and whispers, of the thin veil between worlds, of the hunger that never truly dies. Then, it chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that sent shivers down her spine. "Don't worry," it whispered, "I'll be seeing you soon." And then, a click. The line went dead. Sarah dropped the phone, her hand shaking uncontrollably. She spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner of her bedroom, the lights on, a blanket wrapped tightly around her, listening to the silence, convinced that whatever had been outside was now inside, waiting. She never saw the shadow again, but the memory of that voice, that relentless scratching, and the chilling words, still haunts her. She sold the house a month later, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, forever listening for the midnight caller of Elmwood Lane, a silent, chilling reminder that some predators, once awakened, never truly sleep. Story 2. The Echoes in the Abandoned Hospital. Mark, a seasoned urban explorer, had a passion for forgotten places. The more dilapidated, the more overgrown, the more stories it seemed to hold, the more he was drawn to it. His latest obsession was the old St. Jude's Hospital, a sprawling Gothic structure that had been abandoned for over 50 years. Local legends whispered of strange experiments, of patients who vanished, and of a pervasive, unsettling silence that clung to its decaying walls. Mark, armed with his camera and a healthy dose of skepticism, saw only a photographic opportunity. He gained entry through a broken window in the basement, the air thick with the smell of dust, decay, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. The hospital was a labyrinth of dark corridors, peeling paint, and rusted equipment. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the grimy windows, casting long, eerie shadows that danced with every gust of wind. Mark moved slowly, his camera clicking, capturing the haunting beauty of its decay. As he ventured deeper, a strange phenomenon began. He started hearing echoes. Not just the echoes of his own footsteps, but other sounds. Faint whispers, distant cries, the clatter of medical instruments, the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there, weaving in and out of the oppressive silence. He tried to rationalize it, the wind, settling pipes, his own imagination playing tricks, but the sounds grew more distinct, more insistent, as if the very walls were reliving their past. He found himself in what appeared to be an old operating theater. The surgical lamp hung precariously from the ceiling, its dusty lens reflecting the faint light. A rusted gurney stood in the center, its straps dangling like skeletal arms. As he raised his camera, a sudden, piercing scream ripped through the silence, so loud, so raw, that Mark dropped his camera, his heart leaping into his throat. It was a woman's scream, filled with an unimaginable pain and terror. It echoed through the empty room, reverberating off the walls. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ceased, leaving behind an even deeper, more profound silence. Mark stood there, trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He tried to tell himself it was a trick of the acoustics, a hallucination brought on by the oppressive atmosphere. But the fear was too real, too visceral. He slowly bent down to retrieve his camera, his eyes darting around the room, half expecting to see a spectral figure materialize from the shadows. He saw nothing, but the air in the room felt heavy, thick with an unseen presence, and the metallic, sweet smell was now overwhelming. He decided to leave. The photographic opportunity had turned into a terrifying ordeal. He navigated his way back through the labyrinthine corridors, the echoes now a constant chorus of whispers and cries, a symphony of past suffering. He could feel unseen eyes on him, a cold, predatory gaze that seemed to follow his every move. He finally reached the broken window, scrambling out into the fresh air, his lungs burning, his body trembling uncontrollably. Mark never returned to St. Jude's Hospital. He tried to rationalize his experience, to dismiss it as a product of his overactive imagination. But the echoes, the screams, the pervasive sense of suffering, remained etched in his mind. He sold his camera, gave up urban exploring, and now avoids anything that reminds him of abandoned places. He learned that day that some places are not just empty buildings, but vessels for lingering pain, silent witnesses to unspeakable horrors. And sometimes, when he's alone in a quiet room, he still hears the faint whispers, the distant cries, the echoes of the abandoned hospital, a chilling reminder that some stories, once heard, can never truly be forgotten. The scream, so raw and visceral, had shattered Mark's composure. He had always prided himself on his unflappable nature, his ability to remain detached, even in the most unsettling of environments. But the sound had been too real, too filled with genuine terror, to be dismissed as a mere trick of the mind. As he fumbled for his camera, his hands shaking, he felt a profound sense of violation, as if he had intruded upon a sacred, sorrowful space. The metallic, sweet smell, once faint, now clung to him, a sickly sweet perfume of decay and despair. He tried to leave, to retrace his steps, but the hospital seemed to shift around him, its corridors twisting and turning, leading him deeper into its decaying heart. The echoes, once subtle, were now a cacophony of whispers, cries, and the frantic beeping of unseen machines. He could hear the faint, rhythmic creak of gurneys, the soft shuffle of unseen feet, the low moans of patients in pain. It was as if the hospital was reliving its darkest moments, and he was trapped within its horrifying memory. He found himself in what looked like a children's ward. Small rusted beds lined the walls, their mattresses long gone, leaving only the bare springs. Faded drawings of stick figures and smiling suns adorned the peeling paint, and then he saw it. A small worn teddy bear, lying on the floor, its single button eye staring up at him. As he reached for it, a faint, childlike giggle echoed through the room, followed by a mournful sob. He recoiled, his heart pounding. The air grew colder, and he felt a small, cold hand brush against his leg. He ran. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get out. The echoes intensified, a chorus of tormented voices, their pleas and screams filling his mind. He could feel unseen hands pulling at his clothes, cold breaths on his neck. The metallic, sweet smell was now overwhelming, making him gag. He stumbled through darkened rooms, past rusted operating tables, through empty waiting areas. The sounds of suffering a constant, horrifying soundtrack to his escape. He finally burst out of a side door. Gasping for air, his lungs burning, he didn't stop running until he reached his car, locking the doors and leaning against the steering wheel. Trembling uncontrollably, he drove away, the image of the little teddy bear, the sound of the child's giggle, and the overwhelming sense of suffering burned into his mind. He never returned to St. Jude's Hospital. He sold his camera, gave up urban exploring, and now avoids anything that reminds him of abandoned places. He learned that day that some places are not just empty buildings, but vessels for lingering pain, silent witnesses to unspeakable horrors. And sometimes, when he's alone in a quiet room, he still hears the faint whispers, the distant cries, the echoes of the abandoned hospital, a chilling reminder that some stories, once heard, can never truly be forgotten, and some places, once entered, can never truly be left behind. Story 3. The Glitch in the Old Arcade. Liam was a nostalgia enthusiast, a collector of vintage video games and arcade machines. His apartment was a shrine to the 80s and 90s, filled with blinking lights, pixelated screens, and the constant hum of old electronics. His latest acquisition was a rare Japanese import arcade cabinet called Crimson Labyrinth. It was a horror game, a pixelated maze filled with grotesque monsters and jump scares. He'd found it in a dusty old warehouse, covered in cobwebs, and had spent weeks meticulously restoring it. He finally got it working. The vibrant, albeit pixelated graphics, glowing in his dimly lit apartment. The game was unsettling. Even for a seasoned horror fan like Liam, the sound design was particularly effective, a cacophony of distorted screams, guttural growls, and a low pulsating hum that seemed to vibrate through the floor. He played for hours, losing himself in the crimson maze, the tension building with each level. Then, the glitches started. Minor at first. A flicker in the screen, a momentary freeze, a distorted sound effect. Liam, being a tech enthusiast, dismissed it as typical for an old machine. He'd tap the side, jiggle a wire, and the game would return to normal. But the glitches grew more frequent, more severe. The screen would pixelate into abstract patterns, the sounds would warp into agonizing shrieks, and the game would sometimes pause, the monsters on screen seeming to stare directly at him, their pixelated eyes burning with an unsettling intensity. One night, as he was playing, the game froze. The screen went black, then flickered back to life, but something was different. The maze was gone. Instead, the screen displayed a single pixelated image of a room. It was his living room, his actual living room, and in the corner of the screen, a small, pixelated figure, barely discernible, was standing there, its head tilted, as if watching him. Liam's blood ran cold. He tried to turn off the machine, but the power button was unresponsive. The image on the screen remained fixed, a terrifying mirror of his own reality. Then, the figure on the screen began to move. Slowly, deliberately. It started to walk towards the center of the room, its pixelated form becoming clearer, more defined. Liam could almost make out the outline of a humanoid shape, its limbs long and spindly, its head too small for its body. It was the same figure he had seen in the game, but now, it was in his living room, on his screen, watching him. He tried to scream, but his throat was dry, his voice caught. He was paralyzed by fear, his eyes fixed on the screen, watching as the pixelated figure reached the center of his living room, and then, it turned. Its pixelated eyes, dark and empty, seemed to bore into his soul. And then, a single pixelated word appeared on the screen, flickering in and out of existence. Play. Liam stumbled back, knocking over a stack of games. He unplugged the machine, yanking the cord from the wall, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The screen went black, the hum died down, and the apartment was plunged into a terrifying silence. He spent the rest of the night huddled in his bed, the lights on, a blanket wrapped tightly around him, convinced that whatever had been in the game was now in his apartment, waiting. He sold the arcade cabinet the next day, at a significant loss, not caring about the money, only about getting rid of it. He stopped collecting vintage games, and now avoids anything with a screen. He learned that day that some games are not just simulations, but portals, gateways to other realities, and some glitches are not just errors, but deliberate invitations. And sometimes, when he's alone in a quiet room, he still feels a cold presence, a silent stare, and he wonders if the glitch in the old arcade is still out there, somewhere, waiting for its next player, its next victim. The single word, play, flickering on the screen, had sent a jolt of pure terror through Liam. He had always prided himself on his logical mind, his ability to dissect and understand complex systems. But this was beyond logic, beyond understanding. The arcade cabinet, once a source of nostalgic joy, was now a malevolent entity, a portal to a horrifying reality. He spent the rest of the night huddled in his bed, the lights on, a blanket wrapped tightly around him, his eyes darting to the corner where the machine stood, a silent, ominous presence. He tried to rationalize it, a power surge, a faulty circuit, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and too much caffeine. But the image of his living room, perfectly replicated on the pixelated screen, and the figure, so clearly defined, so undeniably there, defied all logical explanation. He tried to convince himself it was a dream, but the memory was too sharp, too vivid, too real. He felt a profound sense of violation, as if his private sanctuary had been breached, his reality twisted into a horrifying game. He decided to get rid of it. The next morning, with the sun streaming through his windows, the machine seemed less menacing, more like a harmless relic. But the memory of the previous night lingered, a cold knot in his stomach. He listed it online, at a ridiculously low price, just wanting it gone. Within an hour, he had a buyer, a young man eager to get his hands on a rare vintage arcade cabinet. Liam felt a pang of guilt as he watched the machine being loaded onto the truck, a silent warning on his lips, but he said nothing. He just wanted it out of his life. For a few weeks, he felt a sense of relief. The apartment felt lighter, the air clearer. He started to sleep soundly again, his nightmares replaced by peaceful dreams. He even started to consider getting back into collecting. But the memory of the Crimson Labyrinth still lingered, a faint shadow in the back of his mind. He tried to forget about it, to dismiss it as a strange, isolated incident. Then, he saw it, a post on an online forum, a picture of an arcade cabinet. It was his Crimson Labyrinth. The young man who had bought it was complaining about strange glitches, about the game freezing, about the screen displaying his living room. And then, the chilling words, and then it just said, play. Liam's blood ran cold. It wasn't over. The game, the glitch, the entity, whatever it was, had simply found a new player, a new victim. He tried to contact the young man, to warn him, to tell him about his own terrifying experience. But the forum post was deleted. The user account vanished. It was as if the game itself was erasing its tracks, moving silently from one victim to the next. Liam now lives with a constant sense of dread, a chilling awareness that the Crimson Labyrinth is still out there, still playing its horrifying game, still seeking new players. He avoids anything with a screen, and the sound of pixelated music sends shivers down his spine. He learned that day that some games are not just simulations, but portals, gateways to other realities, and some glitches are not just errors, but deliberate invitations. And sometimes, when he's alone in a quiet room, he still feels a cold presence, a silent stare, and he wonders if the glitch in the old arcade is still out there, somewhere, waiting for its next player, its next victim, forever playing its horrifying game.